The Zelda community finds itself in an interesting situation. There's a great divide among the different groups regarding what the future of Zelda should look like. This is not new. There's been a large divide in the fanbase since the release of Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild eschewed the classic Zelda formula that dominated the series for 20 years, and it was massively successful, selling over 300 million copies, 3 times as many as the previous best-selling Zelda game, which made the legacy audience a minority of the fanbase overnight. If you loved the older games but you didn't like Breath of the Wild, then for you, the future of the series was bleak. But now things are different. The release of Tears of the Kingdom has given people a new perspective. There's still a divide, but the nature of that divide has changed.
On May 12, 2023, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. I still haven't forgiven them.
I'm not trying to be this negative, and I appreciate that they are more diverse than last time, but they took more of a baby step than a leap, and I'm not even sure I'd say these are better than Divine Beasts. The Water Temple especially is a bunch of nothing, no different than any of the platforms you explored to get there. I could include the 5th Quasi-Temple in the list, but it would be the worst of them. If I ranked every 3D Zelda dungeon, none of these would even crack the middle.
One of my gripes with the Divine Beasts as dungeons was that they all felt very similar. They all featured the same ancient Sheikah design, the same enemies, and were solved in the same way, by activating terminals. And every one of these problems has been carried over into these new temples. They were all built by the Zonai, they're all populated by constructs, and they're all solved again by activating a set of terminals. While I do appreciate the effort that went into giving each of them a unique quest, theme, and boss, they don't solve any of the actual issues Breath of the Wild had with its dungeons.
It was there that I found a recycled mini-boss from the tutorial island. Yay! Once I defeated it, I was able to activate yet another terminal and was told I'd be granted a rare piece of armor, cloaked in otherworldly evil. The pedestal with the treasure chest rose up from the ground. I went to open it, and... Are you kidding me? This can't be serious. They cannot be serious. The payoff to all of this is recycled DLC armor from Breath of the Wild? I could forgive the underwhelming ground maze. I could forgive the underwhelming sky maze. I could even forgive the recycled boss fight. But this? This is my reward? Armor that you can't even upgrade? If they were gonna recycle armor from Breath of the Wild, which is already lazy on the face of it, why not the Barbarian armor? That would have made sense. You got the Barbarian armor from the mazes in Breath of the Wild. Phantom fucking Ganon from Ocarina of Time? What does this have to do with this maze, with the Ruler of Owls, with anything? Worst of all, this was just one piece of an armor set, meaning the other 2 mazes would reward me with the other 2 pieces. I cannot possibly overstate how disappointed I was by this. This moment radicalized me.
3 temples, the 4th one, will still explain you the same story for a 4th time. It will still be like, wow, I wonder why Zelda summoned a giant spider on us. A giant Goma. That's weird. It's not really like her. At this point, and I know everyone talks about this, right? Like, I'm repeating what you've heard other reviewers and people making video essays on this video say, but I do want to give you my thoughts on them. And my thoughts are not very different. Why can Link not talk? Like, why can he not at least, like, wave or, like, do something to tell these helpless sages what's happening? Why, after having already maybe obtained the Master Sword, having figured out exactly what happened to Zelda, having figured out how the time travel is, what the time travel is all about, having figured out that Zelda that's going around Hyrule Castle is fake, why do we still need to let our little sages believe that this Zelda is real? Like, every time you go to a global phenomena area, these sages will be like, oh, what? Why did Zelda do this? Link is just like standing there, not doing anything. And then, like, after you finally do all 4 dungeons, right? After you finally do them, you go back to Lookout Landing, and still, you look through the telescope, and Pura's like, what is Zelda doing there? Like, please. Like, please.
You see what I'm saying? Why now? It's almost because Nintendo just knew kind of what they wanted to do, but they didn't know how to connect it to Breath of the Wild, so they didn't.
People are not happy with Tears of the Kingdom. It is the most complained about Zelda game I have ever seen. I don't believe it is part of some Zelda cycle. and I don't think it will become more fondly remembered as time passes. The novelty and technical achievement of Ultra Hand in the physics engine may be seen as more impressive in the future, but I think the game itself will suffer as time highlights more and more of its flaws. If anything, I think Breath of the Wild will be seen more favorably in comparison. I think that's already happening. Negative Tears of the Kingdom videos keep releasing, even now. What's most interesting to me is who's making these videos. The people that are complaining are the ones who started playing with Breath of the Wild or who liked Breath of the Wild. The YouTubers that built their career off of it. It's not just the classic Zelda fans that are having a fit, it's now the Breath of the Wild fans that have found common cause with those classic Zelda fans against Tears of the Kingdom. I think that's evidence that there's a different problem. With the release of Tears of the Kingdom and now Echoes of Wisdom, everybody is wondering what's next. Everyone has a think piece, everyone has an opinion about where the series should go. This video is my contribution to that discussion. To begin with, I think it's important to recognize that the next 3D Zelda game will be open world. It will be like Breath of the Wild, it will not be like Ocarina of Time. They may change the art style, they may change weapon breaking, it may be set in a different version of Hyrule, or not in Hyrule at all. But it will still be a large open world with the ability to climb any terrain. Given these constraints, what I want is what I've always wanted. I want to take what classic Zelda games did well and apply them to the current open world formula. I want a better, more linear story, and better, more linear dungeons with puzzles that can't be easily circumvented. I think we're at a point where these are not controversial desires. Their benefits are obvious to everyone, whether they like classic Zelda games or not. Nintendo won't compromise when it comes to player freedom. It is a guiding principle in their modern Zelda games. They won't budge when it comes to the open world. But I think they can be convinced when it comes to the dungeons. They might have already been convinced. Breath of the Wild introduced the Divine Beasts. They sucked. They were tiny, they had almost no enemies, no real challenge to speak of. They all shared the same hideous aesthetic, and they culminate in 4 unmemorable, ugly bosses that nobody cares about or likes. They really were the opposite of what a Zelda dungeon is supposed to be. For Tears of the Kingdom, though, Nintendo said before release that there were traditional Legend of Zelda dungeons in the game. There weren't, but you can tell that they tried. The problem is that the dungeons were still short, they still amount to activating 4 unconnected switches that can be activated in any order, and any puzzle in the dungeon can be circumvented or ignored with the use of Ultra Hand and Auto Build. It does not tap into the appeal of classic Zelda dungeons. Their appeal is that they're beautiful, they're lengthy, they're multi-level labyrinths that you like exploring. They don't have 4 unrelated puzzles, rather they have a series of linear puzzles that build on related mechanics. Modern Zelda games really don't want you to get stuck on a puzzle. They want every puzzle to have multiple solutions. But there's a difference between every puzzle having multiple solutions and every puzzle having the same 4 solutions. That's the problem Tears of the Kingdom has. I recognize effort was made to differentiate them from the Divine Beasts, but I don't think half measures will work here. Dungeons need restrictions. You can have your open world, you can have the total player freedom Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom embody, but in the dungeons at least, there's a need for linearity. Player freedom is not a synonym for good. There are places where restrictions are necessary and beneficial for the player experience. And Nintendo knows that. They already enforce those restrictions for the sake of puzzles. In shrines, you can't climb walls. You can't use auto-build. You can't use the Zonai devices that you found outside the shrine. And there are many that will actively take things away from you in order to force you to use what's inside the shrine. If you ask people, what's your favorite Breath of the Wild shrine? Many will tell you it's Eventide Island. Which is funny because Eventide Island takes away all your weapons, your armor, your ability to save, and yet everybody loves it. The same thing applies to the Great Plateau. It's many people's favorite area, and what they remember about Breath of the Wild most fondly. And that's even though you are the most restricted you will ever be. I don't think there's any reason why we can't have both. By all means, shower me with the virtues of unmitigated freedom for 90% of the game. Let me choose where to go, and give me options of what dungeons to tackle. But inside of those dungeons, I want a more focused experience. A dungeon needs to be atmospheric, reflecting the environment it's found in. It needs to be visually distinct from all other dungeons. It has to have a variety of enemies adapted to that area, and it absolutely needs puzzles that I need to interact with and solve. It's fine if those puzzles have more than one solution, but it's not fine if the same set of solutions can be used to circumvent or ignore every puzzle. The combat in modern Zelda games sucks. There are only 3 weapon types: one-handed weapons, two-handed weapons, and spears. Which means that there are only 3 movesets that you're expected to make do with for the entire game. Each weapon category attacks in the same way. Every one-handed weapon, be it a sword, a club, a sickle, or the Master Sword itself, shares the same 4-hit combo. Spears all do the same pokes, and two-handers do the same lethargic 2 swings over and over. The heavy attacks for all these weapons are the same, with maybe one exception, and this gets boring very quickly for a game that you could be playing for hundreds of hours. Especially when having your weapons break and finding new ones is such an important part of the reward system. A game this size needs to have a bigger weapon variety. Add fist weapons, separate the swords and the club moveset. Add in rapiers and axes, each with their own distinct moveset. We need at least 10 more. The way that each weapon attacks also isn't great. For example, one-handers root you to the ground, giving you no forward momentum. The final hit to these combos usually knock the enemy away. If it's an enemy with a lot of HP, this creates an annoying situation where you go up to it, knock it away with your attacks, then you have to stop, shuffle towards it, before you can resume attacking. It's even more annoying with two-handed weapons since it has this anemic 2-hit combo that will have you chasing enemies. I've always described the attacks in Breath of the Wild as rooting you to the earth, but until I worked on this video I never understood why it felt so restricting. But I figured it out. You can't move or change the direction of your attacks once you begin a combo. You're locked in that direction until the combo is done, which is such a strange, arbitrary restriction that only serves to make the combat feel worse. Look at Elden Ring in comparison. You can change the direction of your combo attack freely and it feels much more natural. It would also be nice if we had more things to swing at. Breath of the Wild was criticized for its small enemy roster, and Tears of the Kingdom didn't do much to improve on that. You are still going to be primarily fighting the same 3 groups of enemies over and over. It is still the smallest roster in any Zelda game, and it's especially egregious when you consider the incredible length modern Zelda games have. So not only are there fewer enemies, but you are also stuck with each for much longer. In my initial Tears of the Kingdom playthrough, I kept hearing about pirates having attacked a village in the south. Lots of NPCs kept mentioning it and directing me there. In my mind I was like, cool, pirates, this must be a new enemy type, maybe even something like the Gerudo pirates from Majora's Mask. So you can imagine my disappointment when I finally get to Lorellan village and see the same stupid pile of Lyssophos and Bokoblins. The Gyptos are a step in the right direction, because they're adapted to the desert and aren't found in other regions. This is what I want. In older Zelda games you'd find enemies endemic to biomes and dungeons that you'd rarely see elsewhere. This has a huge effect on a game's atmosphere because then you're not just dealing with demons spawned by Ganon, you're dealing with animals adapted to the area. Imagine if the jungle biome had Dekubabas and Skulltulas, or if the mountain had Dondongos and the desert had Levers. Modern Zelda games would benefit from this even more than the classic ones did, because one of the greatest strengths of Breath of the Wild is its atmosphere. There's a powerful slowness to it, an immersion, that no other Zelda game can match. So more variety would not just make the combat better, it would make the world feel less empty and more real. There's one more thing we need more variety of, and that is skills. In Twilight Princess there were 7 hidden skills that you could add to your swordplay. They were things like doing huge damage to an enemy that's knocked down, doing a shield bash to try and break through an enemy's guard, dashing behind an enemy to attack at their back, things like that. They really opened up and added another dimension to combat. And as we have lots of different weapon types, there could be unique skills for each different weapon, really expanding the way that each weapon plays. Maybe even giving each weapon a use case that the others don't have. And it could help address the rewards problem. We'll talk more about that later, but Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have terrible rewards, maybe one of the worst reward systems of any open world game. There's simply not enough stuff to give to people. And so having different weapon skills available for each different kind of weapon would go a long way to giving people the kind of permanent rewards that they'll be happy with. As for the difficulty, in the early stages of Breath of the Wild, I thought its difficulty was perfect. The combat is simple, and the stealth system is simple, but it's also unforgiving. For many of the early hours, you'll have no access to good armor, limited access to weapons, and you won't have accumulated many food items. Even if you did have a lot of healing, their utility at that point is limited since your armor and health are so low that some encounters will one-shot you, or come close to one-shotting you. You don't have access yet to Mipha's Grace or fairies, and you don't even know that they exist. In this early environment, attacking an enemy encampment is a joy. It requires a plan, and for the plan to go well, you can use your bow to silence the lookouts, use stealth with your strongest weapon to remove the highest tier enemy or the enemy carrying the most dangerous weapon, and then grab that weapon before the enemies can use it against you. If you mess up, the stronger enemies will kill you in 1 or 2 swings, which means engaging in direct combat requires you to be proficient in the game's mechanics. Each of these systems is simple, with very little complexity, but almost every encounter had me using all of them, and that's all I ever want in my video games. I just want to have reasons to use the mechanics they present me with. If you go back to the early reviews for Breath of the Wild, you'll find almost all of them describe what I'm talking about. They described the combat as difficult and unforgiving, and that's because they were reviewing Breath of the Wild as it exists in the early game. They likely hadn't gotten to the endgame by the time they made those reviews. Sadly, this state of affairs doesn't last very long as you start acquiring armor, food items, champion abilities, and weapons. Dying becomes next to impossible. The food items heal a lot. In fact, you can make food items that heal more than all of your health, and you can carry more than you'll ever need. This means the only threats are enemies that do so much damage it catches you off guard, but in those cases you have Mipha's Grace or fairies to revive you. The difficulty that existed in the early game just disappears, which means that the game that those early reviewers were talking about doesn't exist 10 hours into the game. For a game that people play for hundreds of hours, I think that's a problem. Now, of course, it's normal and good for you to acquire resources and equipment that makes the game easier as you progress. I wouldn't want to be stuck constantly struggling for your whole playthrough. But I also think the process of getting comfortable with the game should be more gradual than what Breath of the Wild provided. You shouldn't be almost unkillable so quickly unless you're really trying, really familiar with the game's mechanics and are trying to exploit them. It shouldn't be the experience for the casual player. So here's what I would do to solve this problem. We need a dedicated healing button. The healing needs to be separated away from the food as a mechanic. Ingredients and food and cooking should still be in the game, but they should be relegated to giving you stat buffs, not healing. Food can do all of the things that it already does, just with the healing aspect removed from it. Attack up, electric resistance, fire resistance, increased stealth, and really they should introduce many more effects than they have currently. Like an effect that makes your sneak strikes do more damage for the duration, one that increases your maximum stamina for a period of time. I think they could go a lot further with the cooking system. But for the healing, it needs to be more simple. I'd like it to function like the healing flasks from Elden Ring. And I'm not saying that just for the sake of making the game harder or for balance. It would make the gameplay feel better. How Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom play currently is too heavily reliant on opening menus. Every time you want to fuse an arrow, you have to open a menu and go choose the type. Every time you want to switch weapons, you're opening menus, pausing the gameplay. And none of it feels worse than when you're stuffing your face full of healing items every time you take a big hit. It's so weird to me that Breath of the Wild went this route, when before this, many of their past titles seem to understand that opening up a menu to do things is bad. So, for example, in Wind Waker, you're able to switch between regular fire and ice arrows at the push of a button, which was a big improvement from having to go into the menu like in Ocarina of Time. When Ocarina of Time 3D came out, they let you tie iron boots to a button press, so you don't have to go into the menu and take them on and off every time. Skyward Sword had the best healing that we have so far. Because the healing was happening in real time, you had to do it during combat. The only problem with it was that you would have to choose amongst your various bottles if you had different potions of different types. But this wouldn't be a problem if we just separate the buffs and the healing to 2 different things. You would only have healing potions at the push of a button, and if you wanted a buff, then you could go through the menu. You would still be going through menus to get those food buffs, but I think it would be a big improvement than what we're doing now. This has an additional benefit of being able to put more rewards in the overworld, which, as I mentioned before, I think is something that is sorely needed. So maybe we start out with 3 bottles, and you'd be able to get more bottles as rewards for quests or out in the overworld, and maybe even have a resource to upgrade those bottles. increasing the potency of the healing. Since I keep talking about needing more meaningful rewards, we have to talk about the reward structure in the modern Zelda games. First, I suppose let's talk about weapon durability. This isn't a critique of weapon durability, I'm not saying it should be removed, but I am saying it contributes to the problem. So we'll have to explain how. One of the biggest appeals in open world games is the sense of freedom and the sense of exploration. Players can go where they want and do what they want, and the ability to see an interesting landmark in the distance and actually reach it to reap rewards adds to that experience. For the developers, the challenge is how to reward the player for their exploration. What do you give them when they go to that landmark? If the world is vast and stunning, it needs to be filled with things for the player to find. This is a challenge that every open world game faces, and they all attempt to solve it in different ways. Breath of the Wild's solution is to give all the weapons a shelf life. If all weapons have a limited lifespan, then they become a resource that players must constantly replenish. While this is an effective solution to the open world problem, it comes with drawbacks. The biggest one is that eventually, players will acquire enough good weapons that it becomes not worth engaging in combat. The joy of exploration is still present, but if players encounter a group of enemies, a bokoblin camp for example, then they have to make a resource calculation in their heads. They need to consider whether the weapons dropped by the enemies are better than the ones they already have. And very early in the game, the answer to that question becomes no. Now that would be fine because typically there should be other rewards other than just the weapons that you're getting from the encounter. For example, if you clear a camp, a treasure chest will open up. The problem is that the chest won't have anything worthwhile, it'll have 5 fire arrows or something. And so the problem is that these encounters won't have meaningful rewards, either with the weapons that you get, or the ostensive reward like the chest that you're supposedly working towards. And this isn't something that happens late into the game. You will quickly realize that you're expected to be intrinsically motivated, that you're doing these things not for the rewards, but for just the joy of doing it. And in my opinion, that's just not good enough. Imagine instead these things were filled with the kinds of rewards I've been describing. Let's say in Kakariko Village there's a sword master, and he tells you, go clear out these bokoblin encampments in this area, and I'll teach you this cool move. Or you open the chest and it has a upgrade that increases your healing flask's ability. Well, in that case, I would be happy to do it. Then I'm happy to waste my weapons durability, because I'm trading them for something of greater value to me. I have a similar problem with shrines. Shrines also contribute to the lack of meaningful rewards, because then shrines are the only place that have restricted puzzles, and they limit the availability of heart pieces to only shrines. So they're no longer in the overworld as part of environmental puzzles, they're no longer rewards for quests. I'm not saying that we should get rid of shrines altogether, but can't we cut them in half and use the development time that would have gone to those shrines to make really big dungeons? Then we can repurpose the heart pieces that would have been in those shrines and sprinkle them across the overworld. In this way, we can put them to better use. We can give them as rewards for minigames, for environmental puzzles, and most importantly, quests, which currently have the worst kind of rewards, and I basically consider them to have no rewards at all. Alright, finally let's talk about the story. I think the biggest weakness of modern Zeldas is their stories. For the moment, I'm not talking about the quality of their plots, I'm talking about their structure. There's a problem with how they tell their stories. In Breath of the Wild, the story isn't told to you over the course of the game. Instead, after the Great Plateau, the king will give you an exposition dump that explains the entire story all at once. He tells you about Calamity Ganon, he tells you about their efforts to prepare, he tells you about the Divine Beasts, how they were taken over, their champions were killed, and you were gravely injured. Finally, he tells you that Zelda is still at the castle using her power to hold Calamity Ganon at bay. It's done this way so that you have all the necessary information to go anywhere. You can tackle the Divine Beasts in any order, or even immediately finish the game. The problem with this approach is that it makes all other story-relevant information optional. All it can do is add context, but it can't change the nature of your quest or provide you with new goals. It can't affect what you're currently doing. You've already been told what to do. Go take on the Divine Beast or fight the last boss. Why is this a problem? Well, because then you can't deviate from that. For example, in Ocarina of Time, the initial goal is to gather 3 spiritual stones, This would let you open the Door of Time, enter the Sacred Realm, and claim the Triforce before Ganondorf does. This plan goes awry as opening the door leads to Ganondorf getting the Triforce and you are trapped for 7 years as your body matures so you can face him. The world has changed in those 7 years, and as a result, so have your goals. No longer do you have a childish plan to stop an ambiguous evil. Ganondorf won. The results of his rule are everywhere. You are now trying to gather the strength to stop him by finding the sages that will help you seal him away. This is an advantage that every previous Zelda game could make use of. Wind Waker transitions from a story of saving your sister to a story of you using the Master Sword by initiating new sages. Twilight Princess starts with Midna wanting to collect fused shadows. When that fails, your goal becomes collecting the Twilight Mirror shards to go into the Twilight Realm. This rising action in a story arc is not something Breath of the Wild can do. It's so focused on your freedom to do anything that it restricts what it can do as a story. It can't raise or lower stakes. It can't build tension. It can't introduce a new villain. And it cannot give you new, more important goals. On the other hand, the memory cutscenes do have a story arc. It has a narrative that builds, peaks, and resolves. And it's really good. This Zelda feels like a failure. She has not awakened to the divine powers that are her birthright. She is bitter. She's even resentful of Link, as he fully embodies his destiny as hero, while she remains a failure. She curses the goddess. Why are her prayers not sufficient? Why can't she do what her mother and grandmother could? She wants to know what's wrong with her prayers. Why are her sacrifices insufficient? What is wrong with her? But the goddess remains silent. The reason her power doesn't awaken is because she's selfish. She doesn't want her powers to save people. She wants them so she stops hating herself. The insight Mipha was about to impart is that when she's healing, she thinks of Link. She thinks of the person she wants to help. Zelda's powers only awaken when she throws herself in front of Link with a desire to protect. Over the years, I've really grown to love the idea of this story. But the problem is, it's not really happening. It's just details about a backstory that King Rome already told you. It's not something that's happening in the present, you're just piecing together what happened in the distant past. And that makes it unimportant, because regardless of what did happen, you're here now. In the present, there is no sadness, no tension, no stakes. All of the emotional highs and lows already happened. You're coming in at the tail end of a story, and all that's left is for you to be the conclusion. You get to kill Ganon and be the finale of a story you didn't really get to participate in. In my opinion, going forward, Zelda games need to tell linear stories. This memory cutscene experiment needs to end. We ran the experiment twice. The results are conclusive. It sucks. The benefits it gives, which is letting you do anything in any order, is not worth the cost. Not only does it restrict what you can do in the story, not only does it make the cutscenes less meaningful because it happened in the distant past, it's also responsible for the worst parts of Tears of the Kingdom's story. The reason you are subjected to the same bad cutscene 4 times is because it has information Nintendo wanted you to have after the first dungeon. Since it wants you to have that information, but refuses to restrict what dungeons you can go into, it just puts that cutscene in every dungeon instead. I appreciate that player freedom is important to how Nintendo sees Zelda now. But in this case, freedom is the problem, and restrictions, linearity is the solution. Echoes of Wisdom is a big step in the right direction. Echoes of Wisdom forces the player to complete the first dungeon, restricting you to a small part of the map until you do. Afterwards, you're able to explore the map freely, and can tackle the next 2 dungeons in any order. Afterwards, it reorients you to a specific dungeon that you have to do, where it advances the story and gives added context before unlocking the next 3 dungeons that again you can do in any order. All this while you can go anywhere on the map. This is great. Echoes of Wisdom actually has a sense of progression and escalation that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom lack. The single dungeons you're funneled into are opportunities to change the nature of the story and give you new, more important goals. The story is linear, but you're given a great degree of freedom for most of the game. This is what I believe we should do in the 3D Zelda games going forward. Linear dungeons, linear story, but a free and open world between them. Alright, finally, I'd like to talk about some of the more miscellaneous things I want. We need to change the art style. One of the best things about the Zelda series is how radically the art style changes from game to game. And almost all of them look really good in their own way. Including the modern Zelda games, they look phenomenal. But it's been almost 8 years of just that. It's time to move on. I'm at a point where it just needs to be different. Even if it looks worse, it will be overall better just because it'll be different from what we've already had. Also, going forward, I don't want to ever see fuse again. In Tears of the Kingdom, you could fuse monster parts to your weapons, and it was hideous. Your weapons looked ridiculous and ugly and horrible. I am a vain fellow when it comes to how my character looks in video games. Don't ever make me use these hideous glued-on weapons ever again. I don't want to see them. I would also like it if we toned down the use of ancient technology. In Breath of the Wild, we had the Sheikah technology littering the landscape. And then in the Tears of the Kingdom, we found out, oh, there was another, even more ancient civilization with highly advanced technology with a green aesthetic. I am pretty tired of it. We need to go back to Ocarina of Time levels of just normal stuff. As for their voice acting, if we are not going to be stuck with this Link and Zelda for another game, which I hope we're not, then we should use the opportunity to replace all of the English voice actors. Zelda's voice actress is terrible, and she did not get any better for Tears of the Kingdom. In my opinion, almost nobody put on a great performance, not even the voice actor for Ganondorf. I know that his voice actor is famous, and people like him, but in my opinion he did not do a good job with Ganondorf. Nintendo should look into how From Software does its hiring for voice actors, because their performances are always exceptional. Finally, the last thing I have to mention is about using the environment to kill enemies. In the early game of Breath of the Wild, it feels great to crush enemies with rocks or shoot a lantern that falls onto explosive barrels, but it quickly stops being useful. Higher tier enemies have a large health pool, and a falling rock won't hurt it at all. It's a shame because it feels great to use these clearly intended mechanics. It's a big part of what early reviewers praised, but it's only useful during that first part of the game. I think the damage done by falling rocks, fire, lightning strikes, and explosive barrels should be greatly increased to the point that they're much stronger than your endgame weapons. Things like silver bokoblins have so much health that it would feel great to be able to occasionally avoid a lengthy battle through clever use of the environment. And I think that's it. These are the things I want from a Zelda game going forward. And if you disagree with me, you're wrong. That's the end of the video. As always, thank you very much for watching.